We've been talking a lot recently about voter suppression efforts by Republicans across the country and how these voter suppression efforts, be it voter ID laws, voter roll purges, they specifically target people of color. And no, that's not an unforeseen consequence. It's a feature of this effort, because if you're a Republican and you're cognizant of the fact that voters of color tend to vote Democrat more often than not, and you don't necessarily know whether or not a white person would vote for a Democrat or Republican, then the way that you eliminate the most votes against you is simply by targeting communities of color. That's what's happening in the state of Georgia, as Secretary of State Brian Kemp put more than 50,000 voter registrations on hold in order to make sure that his Democratic opponent, Stacey Abrams, doesn't win. And let me remind you that of the 50,000 voters that are on hold, the overwhelming majority of them are, in fact, voters of color. Now, we're seeing the same thing happen in the state of Nevada as well, and we have another example of that in the state of Kansas. And the details here are incredibly blatant. I mean, they couldn't even come up with an excuse to make it seem as if what they're doing is not trying to suppress the vote of people of color. So getting to the details here, as Roxana Hedgeman of the Wichita Eagle reports, iconic Dodge City moves its only polling place outside town. Now, this is suspicious given the details of this election and the demographics of Dodge City. And according to Real Clear Politics, the state's gubernatorial race is a complete toss-up at this point, and with Republican Kris Kobach and Democrat Laura Kelly polling within the margin of error, it's super close, right? So that means every single vote is going to matter. And Dodge City is important here because this is a city that's majority minority voters, with 60% of the population being Hispanic. And given that Hispanic voters are more likely to vote for Democrats over Republicans, the race could literally come down to voters in this particular city. But one of the reasons why these voters haven't necessarily had the biggest impact in the past is because, as Hedgeman explains, the city is located 160 miles west of Wichita, and it has only one polling site for its 27,000 residents. So voting in this district is already incredibly difficult, as voters are required to wait more than an hour on average in this particular area. Now, it's no surprise that they're having to wait a minimum of an hour to vote because, quote, that single polling site services more than 13,000 voters in the Dodge City area, compared to an average of 1,200 voters per polling site at other locations, said Micah Kubik, executive director of the ACLU in Kansas. Now, the impact of having just one polling place in this city is having a demonstrable impact on voter turnout, and it is lowering the turnout of Hispanic voters. Quote, a Democratic Party database compiled from state voter data shows Hispanic turnout during non-presidential elections is just 17% compared to 61% turnout for white voters in Ford County in 2014. Dodge City's turnout is below the national turnout rate of 27% among Latino-eligible voters in 2014, which in itself was a record low that year for the country, according to the Pew Research Center. So in a city where Hispanic voters could potentially tip the scales of really close elections in favor of Democrats, their voices have been hindered by a lack of polling places needed to accommodate the demand for voters who actually want to make their voices heard. But knowing that having just one polling place might not necessarily stop these voters from voting altogether, what are Republicans doing now? They're just removing that polling place from the town altogether. And as Hedgeman reports, for this November's election, local officials have moved it outside the city limits to a facility more than a mile from the nearest bus stop, citing road construction that blocked the previous site. And this is a phenomenon that's been happening across the country. Kansas is not the only state that has closed polling sites. Polling places across the country have also been shuttered since the U.S. Supreme Court in 2013 struck down parts of the Voting Rights Act. A 2016 research report from the Civil Rights Coalition Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights found local officials had shuttered 868 polling places in the 3 years after the court's ruling. So let's just take a moment to reflect on all of these details here. We have a city that has majority minority voters. It was already difficult for these individuals to cast their votes because there was one polling place. And as a result of having only one polling place, turnout was well below the national average. But knowing that even that wasn't enough to stop these Hispanic people from voting, they just removed that polling place altogether, knowing that that could very well determine who wins and loses, seeing that this race is so close. This is one of the most blatantly undemocratic things that is going on in this country. And Republicans, they're not even being subtle anymore about their desire to suppress the vote. They're openly advocating to suppress the vote. They're concocting conspiracies about voter fraud and how rampant that is, which is just pure propaganda. And their goal is very clear. Suppress the vote, beat the Democrat. And if it is the case that we don't see a gigantic blue wave on November 6th, we know that it's going to, in part, be due to disgusting election rigging from Republicans. Now, in the event the Democratic gubernatorial candidate in this race, Laura Kelly, wanted to actually file a complaint and take this issue up with the Kansas Secretary of State, well, the problem is that the current Secretary of State happens to be none other than her Republican opponent, Kris Kobach. So there's really no recourse for her in this instance, which is the same situation we're seeing in the state of Georgia, where Stacey Abrams is running against a Republican gubernatorial candidate who also happens to be their Secretary of State. So as Secretary of State, Kris Kobach in this instance is able to impose restrictions on voting in order to advance his own political career. And as Secretary of State, he hasn't even been very subtle about his vote suppression agenda, and he actually has lobbied the Trump administration in an attempt to convince them to gut voting rights, even more so than they already have. He also led President Trump's so-called voter fraud commission after Donald Trump fabricated a myth about millions of people voting illegally in the 2016 election. And when it comes to this phenomenon of voter fraud, the reason why people are freaking out about this is because Republicans are peddling propaganda. In fact, Donald Trump is encouraging these types of voter suppression efforts. He recently tweeted out, quote, "All levels of government and law enforcement are watching carefully for voter fraud, including during early voting. Cheat at your own peril. Violators will be subject to maximum penalties, both civil and criminal." Now, this is just pure projection. Notice how he's talking about the other side cheating. But he's not going to acknowledge the fact that what he's doing and Republicans across the country are doing, it's tantamount to cheating. They're trying to rig elections across the country by suppressing the vote because they're afraid that in these really close races, they might lose because these people of color might come out to vote and determine who wins or loses. So they're trying to stop that. Now, when it comes to this phenomenon that is voter fraud, just how rampant is it specifically? Well, as Sammy Edge and Sean Holstage of NBC News explains, a study of 2,068 alleged election fraud cases in 50 states between 2000 and 2012 found that the level of fraud was infinitesimal compared with the 146 million voters registered over the 12-year period. The analysis found only 10 cases of voter impersonation, the only kind of fraud that could be prevented by voter ID at the polls. In further analysis conducted this year, News 21 reviewed cases in Arizona, Ohio, Georgia, Texas, and Kansas, where politicians have expressed concern about voter fraud and found hundreds of allegations but few prosecutions between 2012 and 2016. Attorneys general in those states successfully prosecuted 38 cases, though other cases may have been litigated at the county level. At least one-third of those cases involved non-voters, such as elections officials or volunteers. None of the cases prosecuted was for voter impersonation. Now, ask yourself this question. If you are a Secretary of State in a red state, do you honestly think you're going to be ignorant to studies like this? If it's your job to maintain the integrity of the vote, do you not think he'd be privy to this type of data? Of course they know about this. They know how rare voter fraud is, but they know exactly what they're doing. They are targeting communities of color. They're suppressing those votes, purging them from the rolls, not accepting new voters, moving polling stations out of their communities, all to make sure that they win, to win by cheating. And they have the audacity to accuse voters of cheating and committing fraud. These are the frauds right here. These Republicans are afraid of democracy. They're undemocratic, and as a result, in order to advance their own career, they're violating the voting rights of these people across the country. This should be a national outrage, and to the mainstream media's credit, they are talking about this story, but this should be something that everyone is screaming from the rooftops about, because if we're going to live in a democracy, we have to make sure that suffrage is universal. It's bad enough that we already don't allow felons to vote, but people who are eligible to vote are having their voices suppressed by Republicans who would rather cheat than win legitimately because they're afraid of voters. I mean, this is absolutely disgusting, and this isn't going to be the last story you hear about this, because these instances of voter suppression cases are popping up across the country. It's really disturbing, and we have to do what we can to sound the alarms, because this is very serious. This is a literal threat to democracy. If this doesn't threaten democracy, then nothing does.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.